This video is part 3 of programming for Unreal Engine, and for this video we're going to talk about C++ syntax. So syntax are the rules that are involved with working with a programming language. The first rule, and these are not official rules, these are just my general philosophies, things I usually work with. The first rule is that every statement ends with a semicolon. A C++ statement, or any statement in any programming language, is a line of code that actually does something. Isn't for setup, isn't for structure, it's there to actually do something. Here, int x equals 5. This creates a variable called x and sets the value of 5. There's a semicolon there at the end. So when in doubt, put a semicolon unless it has a curly brace. If it has a curly brace, so it has curly braces like this, which these are really bad curly braces. These do not get semicolons. Next, you need to remember that C++ is case sensitive. Hello and hello are not the same. Capital H, lowercase h are different. So int num equals 10. This is correct, there's nothing referring to it, but int num with capital N is a different variable altogether. These are two different things. There are naming conventions that say when you should capitalize, when you shouldn't, but that's not what this is about. For now, I just want you to really understand that C++ is case sensitive. You need to pay attention to your capitalization. Whenever there's an issue with student code, in my experience, 7 out of 10 times it's a capitalization issue. Syntax rule 3, braces and blocks. So curly braces are define code blocks. So here we have if x is greater than 0, curly brace, then cout positive number, then ending curly brace. You must use curly braces for function bodies. If there's only one line, technically you don't need to, but you should always. They are there to help you define what that code block is. They're used for function bodies, control structures, classes, loops, methods. You also must match them in the proper order. It's really common to have multiple curly braces and multiple things that need curly braces. You have to pay attention to which one's referring to which. The order is how you can tell. You have this curly brace, this beginning curly brace, opening curly brace. The very next closing curly brace is matched to that one. We had another conditional above here, or a method, or what our function. The order is how you know which one's which. Next, variable declarations. Variables must be declared before you use them. The data type is required when declaring as well. So if you want to use a variable called age, you have to declare it first. This is a variable declaration. You're defining what it is. It also is assignment, but we declare it, we say, hey, int age, made a variable. We are choosing to assign to it here as well, but in reality, the declaration has to happen first. And in C++, because it is strongly typed, you have to give it the data type. Spaces matter. Date of birth will work. There's no spaces here. However, when you have date of birth with spaces in between, these are now 3 different statements, 3 different things. The compiler does not know that you meant date of birth as one object or one thing. By putting the spaces in between it, you're saying it's something different. This is most important when it comes to variables and functions, which we'll learn about later. But for now, a date of birth, this works. Does not follow Unreal conventions, but it works. When you put spaces in between, these are now 3 different things, and you'll end up throwing an error over here. Then next, spaces around things don't matter. Spaces inside of things, between things do, but spaces around don't. You can have as much white space as you want. This is referred to as white space. It's the spaces between statements, the tabs that you have at the beginning of things, which line things happen on, right? This can be written out in one line, or you could get rid of all these extra spaces and have it much more compact. However, at the end of the day, the spaces between things don't matter. Use this to your advantage. Help yourself organize your code. So those are rules. But then there are a few guidelines, right? They're not entirely required for your code to run, but they're just best practices. So for one, you should have your variable names easy to understand. You could make a function banana that calculates Pythagorean theorem, but it wouldn't be very easy to understand that, right? So string name equals Billy. That's good. That works. String x equals Billy. This would be bad. That is a variable name that doesn't tell you anything. Now, there are a few different guidelines for capitalization, camel case, things like that. Unreal has their own guidelines, which we'll talk about later. When combining words for a class, you should always capitalize the first letter. Again, we'll get to more of those capitalization things later. Another guideline, use of comments. You should comment your code to explain why, not what. This means explain why this thing's being used, not what it is. So here explains why the formula is being used. Calculate area, right? Here, this comment is a formula for rectangle area. That way you know what it is. A bad one would be something obvious, like string name equals Billy. It stores a name. That's a waste of letters you just typed, right? It's obvious, we know that, right? You want to avoid over-commenting or commenting obvious code. However, you want to err on the side of, if you're not certain what it's supposed to do, and other people might not know what you meant by it, go ahead and write a comment, though you should probably rewrite your code if you get to that point. Next, indentation. Use consistent indentation. Indentation, like hit tab, to keep things in line with their code block. So this code block, int main, curly brace, these two things are the same level. We know they're the same level because they're spaced just the same amount away from the beginning of the page. We also know that this int main and this if statement is part of int main because it's tabbed over inside of it. And here we have the cout statement. We can tell that this is part of this if statement because it's tabbed over even more inside of it. All right, curly brace placement. This is one that's going to be kind of annoying, but it does not matter which line that your opening curly brace goes on when you have an if statement. So here we have if x greater than 5 curly brace, all in one line. Another option is having that starting curly brace on a different line. Epic Games Standard uses option 2. Me personally, I prefer option 1 for short blocks where you just have like one thing. But I'll use option 2 when I'm coding for students as it can be a lot clearer. You can easily see what curly brace belongs with what if you've followed your alignment guideline. Next is consistency. You want to keep your style consistent. By this, I mean space things out the same way. Use the same style for naming things and keep things neat and clean. So space things out so you can easily understand them and be consistent when you do that. You could have things all bunched up together, sure, but you should have things spaced out and then be consistent about it. If one line of code you do it right and the next line you do it a different way, it gets a lot harder to read. When you have really long documents, keeping things consistent can help you and help other people understand your code better because they're not trying to figure out why you changed something. Another guideline, you want to avoid hard coding. We'll see instances of this later. But if you have a specific value that might change at some point, you want to make it a variable or a constant. If we have a program that does something based on the number of students, the maximum number of students of 30, and we do a loop that involves that, because the number of students might change, we want to make it a variable that we can modify without having to change everything else. This will be especially important when working with things like Blueprint or really large documents in C++, because having to parse through an entire document just to find one little thing that you had to change, and you forgot to change this other thing, and it gets annoying. We'll see instances of this pretty early on in our coding adventure. Next, chunk it out. If you have a section of code that looks really, really long, you want to consider breaking into a smaller chunk into a function for each single task. So here I have a function that handles taking damage. I could have update health and subtract points instead of here, but really, taking damage, I just want to be able to look and see, all right, I want to update health. Great. Let's subtract the points. Great. I don't care how this happens once I've written it. Subtracting points, I write this function one time, and then I just want to be able to use it again later. I don't have to think about it. Right. So here, take damage, I call it take damage. I update health, which happens somewhere else in a different function. I subtract points, which calls this. which will take your current points minus the points you take, whatever. Then we want to handle print score. Print score handles printing the score out, right? Once you do that once, you don't want to have to rewrite that again. So when you chunk it out, you make it so you don't have to repeat yourself. DRY, dry principle. Next, there are some coding standards for Unreal Engine. There's a link here to what those are. It's pretty long. But the big ones, naming conventions. The first letter of each word in a name, such as a type name or variable name, is capitalized in Epic Games and for Unreal. There's also usually no underscore. For example, health, capital H, and U primitive component, they're correct. They follow these guidelines. However, these two would last mouse coordinates with lowercase l and delta with a delta coordinates with a underscore there. Those don't. This won't matter too much. Your code will still work just fine, but we usually try and keep it to the naming conventions that are recommended. Then finally, and this is going to be more relevant later, I just want to introduce it here. But type names are prefixed with an additional uppercase letter to distinguish them from variable names. For instance, you have a actor is a type name, where actor is the instance of type A actor. Unreal Header Tool requires some of these things, so you're going to see like random letters thrown in front of things, but not random, they do mean something. Big ones are like classes that inherit from U object. So if it's an object in Unreal Engine, you put a U in front of it. If it's an actor, you put an A in front of it. So on and so forth. We're not going to worry too much about this list later. It's going to be more relevant as we really dig deeper into Unreal Engine. But I just wanted you to kind of understand why you'll see some things looking a little weird maybe. That's because this is how Unreal Engine is built. To have it prefixed to let you know, hey, this is an object, this is an actor, this is a widget, so on and so forth.